They thought she was just another suspect. They had no idea Monica Jefferson was the most powerful attorney in the state. It was well past 11 at night, but Monica was in no hurry. She had just spent a long day in court, moving from case to case. Her mind was a battlefield of arguments, evidence, and sharp punchlines. Now all she wanted was to fill up and go home. She stopped at a Chevron gas station in Birmingham, Alabama. A sigh of relief escaped her as she pressed the button to activate the gas pump. The warm glow of the overhead lights cast long shadows across the pavement. The silence was broken only by the occasional sound of passing cars on the highway. Monica reached for the pump, her thoughts drifting elsewhere. Maybe when she got home she would pour herself a glass of wine, or maybe she would finally finish the book that had been sitting on her nightstand for weeks. She didn't notice the patrol car slide silently into the parking lot until she heard the door slam shut. 2 officers got out. One was older, broad-shouldered, walking with the confidence of someone used to giving orders. The other was younger, his eyes eagerly following his colleague's every move as if looking for direction. Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker. Monica felt their eyes before she turned. It was a look she was familiar with. The suspicious, assessing look she'd seen countless times in the courtroom. "Ma'am," Matheson said, his tone authoritative. "We need to see your identification." Monica's fingers paused on the pump. She looked up, knowing exactly where this was going. "Why?" Her voice was calm but clear. "Routine check," Matheson said, each word clipped. Monica looked around. The gas station was deserted, no one but herself being questioned. She exhaled slowly, pulling her wallet from her purse. "I'll give you my papers," she said, her voice even. "But first, tell me why you stopped me." Barker stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the car. "We've had a report of a stolen black Lexus in the area," he said. "Yours matches the description." Monica almost laughed. She'd owned the car for 4 years, the plates were in her name, the insurance was in her name. A car reported stolen? Really? When was it reported stolen? She asked, her eyes never leaving Matheson. Matheson narrowed his eyes. "Don't make this harder than it is." Monica didn't budge. She'd been in situations far more stressful than this, murder trials, federal corruption cases. But she knew better than to argue in a situation like this. She handed over her ID, keeping her face impassive as Matheson took it. Meanwhile, Barker walked around the car, his hand on the hood as if checking for signs of trouble. "I need you to step out of the car," Matheson ordered. Monica's patience was at its breaking point. "You have my papers. Check them, you'll see that this car belongs to me." Barker paused at the driver's side door, looking into the car. "What's that in the passenger seat?" he asked, his voice filled with suspicion. Monica followed his gaze. "Her briefcase, the thing she carried with her to court every day." "That's my job," she said, her voice barely concealing her exhaustion. But they weren't done yet. And Monica knew her night was far from over. Matheson stepped forward, his eyes alert. "Open the trunk," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Monica raised her eyebrows, keeping her voice calm. "You have no legitimate reason to search. This car belongs to me, legally. You have no right." Matheson narrowed his eyes, irritation flashing across his face. He turned to Barker, gesturing. Monica could feel the tension rising, a situation she had seen too many times that could explode at any moment. Barker's voice crackled over the radio, calling the dispatcher. Monica's heart rate increased, but not from fear, but from sharp focus. She had devoted her career to upholding justice, to preventing overreach like this. Now here she was, facing an officer who was looking at her like a problem. "Ma'am, please step out of the car," Matheson demanded, his voice hardening. Monica remained motionless, knowing that this situation would not end easily. "What if I refuse?" Matheson's face darkened. Then we'll do it the way we don't want to. She noticed the change in his posture, his shoulders straightened, his body rigid, his body language signaling an aggressiveness she was all too familiar with. I won't say it again, Matheson growled. Get out of the car. Monica kept her composure, her voice steady. Sergeant, you know this is illegal. Matheson took a deep breath, trying to control herself. You're resisting a lawful order. There's nothing legal here, Monica replied, but she also knew her words might not make any difference. Barker acted first, his hand grabbing her wrist with force, and before she could react, Matheson had grabbed her other arm, twisting it behind her. Are you serious? Monica hissed, trying to twist. Stop. Don't resist. Barker shouted, but she didn't, they just needed an excuse. The handcuffs tightened around her wrists, the sound cold in the silence. You are under arrest for noncompliance, Matheson announced, his jaw clenched. They turned her around, pressing her against the car. The roughness of their movements was not random, this was a show of power, an escalation tactic she had seen too many times. Do you have anything to report? Barker asked, his voice full of suspicion. Monica didn't answer. She knew this fight was far from over. Barker's hand moved slowly, deliberately, patting her purse with caution. Monica stared straight ahead, her eyes trained on the front as she calmly checked her purse. Get it out of the hood, Matheson ordered Barker, his voice clipped and impatient. Barker complied, pulling it out and revealing the contents, keys, wallet, and then, a sleek leather case. Barker flipped it over. Official identification gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Monica's photo, her name, and the words, State Attorney's Office. Chief Prosecutor. The room fell silent. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Matheson snatched the identification from Barker's hand, his eyes scanning the embossed letters and the gold state seal glinting in the light. As he read, his face paled slightly. You're making a mistake, Monica said. Her voice was calm but sharp as steel. Matheson blinked, trying to process what was happening. Barker shifted uncomfortably, his discomfort evident. Sergeant, what should we do? Barker's voice was uncertain. Matheson hesitated. The gravity of their actions weighed heavily on him. They had just arrested the woman in charge of overseeing the police department's racial profiling investigation. And now, they were stuck. Take the damn handcuffs off, Matheson muttered. Barker didn't move. I said take the damn handcuffs off. Matheson shouted. Barker fumbled with the key, the sound of metal scraping against metal breaking the tense silence. Finally, the handcuffs came free. Monica rubbed her wrists, her eyes never leaving the two men before her. Matheson forced a forced, uncomfortable smile. It's just a misunderstanding. But Monica didn't smile. She tucked her ID card carefully into her coat pocket. Okay, she said softly, her gaze steady. But misunderstandings don't usually come with handcuffs. And this isn't over. She stood still, the dull ache in her wrists a reminder of the humiliation she'd just endured. The weight of the moment weighed on the two men before her. Matheson looked like a man who'd just plunged off a cliff without realizing it. Barker, younger and less experienced, seemed unable to hold still, his fingers twitching at his sides. This doesn't have to go any further, Matheson said, his voice strained as he tried to regain his composure. Monica let the words hang in the air. She'd spent her career fighting for people who never had a chance. People dragged out of cars, smashed onto the pavement, humiliated in front of their families all because the police saw them as problems rather than people. She took a slow, steady breath. You arrested me without cause. You handcuffed me. You conducted an illegal search. And now you want to leave. Matheson swallowed. We don't know who you are. Monica's eyes narrowed, and if I weren't the DA, would we still be having this conversation, or I'd be in the back of your cruiser right now? Neither of them answered. Barker finally looked up. His face looked uncertain. Monica stood still, her eyes a cold calm. Barker and Matheson stood before her, two men with defensiveness in their every move. Neither wanted to break the silence first. "You think it's over?" Monica asked, her voice low but clear. "Think that because you take the handcuffs off, everything will go away?" Barker shifted slightly, but said nothing. Matheson just stood there, his shoulders tense. "How long have you been on the force?" Monica asked, her eyes moving from one to the other. 5 years, Barker answered, his voice uncertain. 18, Matheson said, his teeth clenched. Monica repeated, her voice soft but heavy. 18 years. She nodded. Long enough to know better. Matheson exhaled through his nose, his hands on his hips as if trying to steady himself. "What do you want from us?" Monica looked at him. "I want you to remember this moment," she said, her voice cold. "Because the next time you stop someone like me, but without this," she held up her badge, "they won't have the same strength to fight back." The silence was long, heavy. Barker glanced at Matheson, his unease evident. Finally, Matheson spoke. "We did wrong. I get it." Monica shook her head. "No, you don't. But you will." Before anyone could say anything more, Barker's radio crackled to life, breaking the tension. "Unit 27, check that stop." The dispatcher's voice crackled. Barker looked at Matheson, waiting for instructions. Matheson exhaled sharply. "All clear," he answered. Barker hesitated for a second, but then pressed the button. "Unit 27, all clear." As the car drove away, she didn't need to look in the rearview mirror to know that they were still standing there, their world suddenly much smaller. The next morning, Monica sat at her desk, her eyes glued to a pile of case files. The irony did not escape her. For months, she had been reviewing complaints against officers in the Birmingham Police Department, each one describing a pattern of racial profiling, excessive force, and illegal stops. And now, she saw it for herself. Monica's office was quiet, but the air was tense, like an approaching storm. On her desk were thick files filled with the names of people who had been humiliated, arrested, or worse, by police errors. Now her name was on one of those files. A knock on the door pulled Monica from her thoughts. Her assistant, Clara Rodriguez, poked her head in, her voice soft but urgent. "They're here." Monica exhaled and nodded, signaling Clara to invite them in. The door opened wider, and Sheriff Walter Grayson entered. His expression was tense, unreadable. Behind him was Internal Affairs Investigator Samuel Owens, carrying a manila folder tucked under his arm. No one wasted time on pleasantries. Grayson cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I've seen the footage." Monica sat up straight, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the desk. "The gas station cameras caught everything," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "I assume you saw the part where they handcuffed me." Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not going to defend them. What happened last night was unacceptable." Monica tilted her head, her eyes sharp. "Then you know what happens next." Owens put the folder down and opened it, revealing the disciplinary reports. Matheson and Barker's names were stamped on it, along with a list of complaints. "How many?" Monica asked, her voice low but firm. Grayson hesitated, but Owens answered for her. 14 complaints against Matheson. 9 against Barker. Mostly racial discrimination complaints. Monica paused, letting that sink in. "And they still patrol the streets," she said, leaning back in her chair. "You know, when I started looking into this department, I had a theory." She clasped her hands together, her eyes never leaving Grayson. "I thought the problem was the system, the leadership turning a blind eye. But last night I realized something else. And what is it? Grayson asked, his voice low. Monica looked him straight in the eye. It's not just the system. It's officers like Matheson and Barker who think they're untouchable. Grayson shifted slightly. I'm putting them both on administrative leave. That's not enough, Monica cut in, her voice sharp as a knife. Owens watched her, his expression cautious. So what do you want? Owens asked. Monica leaned forward, her voice firm. I want them off the force. The office fell silent, heavy. Grayson sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. Monica, you know how hard it is to fire an officer. With union protection, even with clear footage, the appeals process can take months. Then make sure they can't appeal, she replied without hesitation. Grayson took a deep breath. You're asking me to throw them to the wolves. Monica didn't blink. No. I'm asking you to hold them accountable. This time, Owens shifted in his chair. If we prosecute them, the department will suffer. Our image is already under scrutiny. Monica let out a short, mirthless laugh. You're worried about the department's image? I was handcuffed, humiliated, and illegally detained by 2 officers with a history of misconduct. If you think I'm going to let this go, you don't know me. The silence stretched, heavy. Finally, Grayson sighed. What charges are you proposing? Monica didn't hesitate. Unlawful detention. Grayson's shoulders slumped, he knew there was no other way to handle this. Owens nodded. I'll draw up the papers. Monica stood up and said one more thing. Both men looked at her. I want a press conference. Grayson frowned. Are you sure? Monica's eyes darkened. I've done this quietly. It's time for the public to know exactly who's protecting them. Because if Matheson and Barker can do this to me, a woman with power and influence, what have they done to people who have no voice? This isn't just about justice. It's about making sure this never happens again. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras flashing every few seconds. The gallery was filled with spectators, community members, activists, other officers watching in silence. At the defense table, Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker sat stiffly in their suits, their badges stripped. Their futures uncertain. Barker stared down at the table, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Matheson kept his jaw tight, his eyes focused forward, his face a carefully detached mask. Monica entered, her heels clicking on the polished floor. She had prosecuted criminals, corrupt officials, even police officers before. But this was different. This time, she was both prosecutor and victim. She sat down, her notes spread out before her. Today was not just about these 2 men. It was about an entire system that had allowed them to operate unchecked. The judge entered and ordered the court into session. The trial began. Monica's colleague, Assistant DA Leonard Briggs, stood up. Your Honor, it will be shown that the defendants, Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker, engaged in an unlawful detention, violated the rights of the victim, and abused their authority under the guise of law enforcement. Matheson's attorney, Victor Langley, stood next, his voice soft and authoritative. Your Honor, my clients acted within the scope of their duties. This was a misunderstanding, not intentional misconduct. A misunderstanding? Monica remained neutral. A misunderstanding doesn't come with handcuffs. Briggs called the gas station manager as his first witness. I was inside watching the cameras, the man testified. She was just pumping gas. Then those 2 guys showed up, and you could tell right away they weren't there to help. Briggs played the surveillance footage. Every second of the wrongful stop was played on the screen. The moment Matheson asked for identification. The moment Barker circled the car. The moment Monica was restrained and handcuffed. And then the moment their faces changed when they saw her badge. Briggs let the footage linger, its weight filling the room. Did those officers seem to have any reason to make that arrest? Briggs asked. No, sir, the manager replied. They were just asserting their authority. Matheson shifted in his chair, his expression unreadable. Across the room, Barker bowed his head. Next witness, Officer Barker, the officer called. Barker hesitated, glancing uncertainly at Matheson before finally standing. He moved toward the witness stand, his steps slow and reluctant. Briggs leaned forward. Officer Barker, let's talk about that night when you approached Miss Jefferson. What made you suspect her? Barker swallowed. There was a report of a stolen vehicle, matching the description. Briggs raised an eyebrow. Did you verify that report before you approached her? No, not at that time. Briggs took a step closer. So you had no real reason to suspect her? Barker shifted in his seat. We just wanted to be sure. Briggs turned to the jury. Wanted to be sure it wasn't probable cause. That wasn't evidence. That was a hunch. Turning back to Barker, he asked, when did you realize you had the state's attorney arrested? Barker's face flushed. After we ran her ID. And you still had her handcuffed. There was a long pause. Finally, Barker muttered, yes. Matheson's attorney objected, but the damage was done. When Monica Jefferson took the stand, her voice was clear and unwavering. I have spent my career making sure people are treated fairly under the law, she told the court. These officers treated me first as a criminal and then as a citizen. The only reason I am standing here today, and not in a cell, is my job title. That should horrify everyone in this room. Her words hung in the air. Matheson's face remained stony, but Barker seemed to shrink back in his chair, a man who realized too late the cost of his actions. Briggs addressed the jury. The law is clear. These men abused their power. Now it is time to hold them accountable. For the first time in their careers, Matheson and Barker are no longer in control. The verdict came more quickly than expected. Monica sat silently as the foreman of the jury rose and cleared his throat. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks. Matheson's shoulders tensed, his mask of indifference slipping. Barker let out a shaky breath, staring at the table as if willing himself to disappear. The judge's gavel rapped on the wood. Sentencing will be scheduled for a later date. Court adjourned. As the judge stepped out, the room erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters rushed forward, voices overlapping. Miss Jefferson, do you feel justice has been served? Do you think this case sets a precedent? What would you say to the people who support these officers? Monica faced the press directly, stepping up to the microphone with the same composure and dignity she had displayed since being handcuffed. Let me be clear, she said, her voice steady and resolute. This was never about revenge. This was about accountability. She scanned the sea of cameras, holding her composure for a moment of wait. This case was important not just because it was a victory, but because it proved what we've always known: when the system fails, the people who are supposed to protect the public become a threat. Officers can't get away unaccountable, but it shouldn't take a courtroom or a high-profile trial to deliver justice. The words echoed, silencing the crowd. Sergeant Matheson and Officer Barker once thought they could act with impunity. That belief ended today. She let her gaze sweep across the cameras again, sending a clear message: if anyone else with a badge shared their thoughts, consider this a warning. With that, she stepped back, ignoring the next round of questions. Justice had been served, but her work wasn't done. Matheson and Barker were officially stripped of their badges. Barker, for his lesser role, received probation and community service. Matheson, with his long history of misconduct, received 2 years in federal prison. For the first time in his life, he would be on the other side of the law, but the victory still left a void. A week later, Monica sat in her office, looking out at the city in motion. For every case like this, how many people were left unheard? How many were stopped, arrested, humiliated, never given a chance to fight back? She reached for the file on her desk, another case, another complaint, another name added to the list. Monica sighed and opened the file. This story is not just about two officers losing their jobs. It is about a broken system, one that has allowed people like them to thrive. So, how many more are there? How many more cases must there be before real change happens? If you believe in accountability, if you believe that justice should not depend on status, please share this story. The more people who see it, the harder it will be to ignore. And if you haven't already, join in for more stories that challenge the system and demand the truth. Because this war is not over.